This is Evolutionary Psychology, the podcast
Actual evolutionary psychology,
by.
actual evolutionary psychologists.
Today we have a repeat customer, Dan Conroy-Beam.
Our first repeat customer. I believe
Is
the
that
first guest
right?
that we've had on for a second time, yeah.
Is that
Or no,
right?
I guess we had Christina on as a co-host
Yeah,
and
we had Christina on
Zach,
as a
yeah.
co-host. Yeah, and we will have the Zach Garfield episode hasn't been, the Ray Hames one isn't out yet, or it might
Right.
have just come out.
But
I'm
this is our
breaking the
first
fourth wall. Yeah.
repeat guest in the guest role.
Substantive. Yes, exactly.
Yes.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
no one better than Dan Conroy-Beam because Dan is deriving from scratch. He is a god among silicone-based agents, recreating the evolution of sex roles, and gender.
Ender.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So this is all about gender. Not all
Yeah.
about, but half about.
Or the complex interrelations between sex roles, and gender. And I found it just really, I don't know, like I knew a lot of the stuff, reading, Dawkins and the evolutionary bios stuff, but it was great to just hear Dan synthesize it and review it and show the elegance of these ideas and how they can be cashed out mathematically, and review just the linkages between, the evolutionary biology of sex and sex roles and how that manifests in gender in a complex cultural species such as Homo sapiens. I found it to be really enlightening and enriching. Um, you know,
Yeah, and I think pitting biology versus culture, we always know that that's wrong. But
yeah,
even going through this in as an exercise in working out the details as carefully and frankly in an unbiased way as one
yeah,
can, as Dan did, it was
yeah,
even for me sort of a check on my own. I was still sort of pitting biology against culture, and I don't think there's obviously lots of heat and temperature, cultural issue wise around gender,
yeah,
especially now. I don't think I think this is orthogonal to all of that, or at least it rises above all of that because it really talks about how there is learning and there are social roles and it is dynamic, but it's also very much grounded in sex. But what sex is more abstract, even if it's biological, and it's
yeah,
more weird. It's making the familiar strange, and even both sides in the culture war. Well, I think what Dan is describing is a far stranger, weirder world than either sides would imagine. I think John Tooby once said that scientists sort of think that reality is like one side or the other for any moment in time in a scientific debate, but
yeah,
reality is far weirder and far way further out than even what either side is arguing typically, if you look
yeah.
across the history of science.
For sure. And because this is such a hot button topic, I feel like Dan has done such a good job of just providing a level head and a North Star through which to navigate these complicated and messy ideas. And I just thought it was a really fun and interesting conversation. I'm sure you'll enjoy it.
Yeah, I loved it, and there's so much I found it inspiring to just be motivated to think about new things to think about, and it made my life as a kid growing up, and just who I thought was a role model just make more sense too.
Yeah, totally.
Enjoy.
All right. Enjoy.
Dan, we've already had you on. We're not going to do any intros. Well, okay. You do Asian-based modeling and
Uh-uh.
empirical work based on that modeling. You're doing a new area. You're investigating a new thing. I don't know, maybe you disagree that it's new. What are
Yeah,
you
I don't know
doing?
that.
Can you either talk about what you're doing now and why you got into it, and or what agent-based modeling is for people who might not know? So choose
I
your own
guess
adventure.
One, thanks for having me back. Hey guys, good to
You're
see you.
welcome.
Hey, yeah.
Yeah, really been enjoying the pod. Like,
Oh, thanks.
I think
Thanks.
there's only two episodes that I are still on my to watch list.
Wow, that's good.
Nice. We got a
Yeah,
super fan. That's
Wow,
great.
yeah, that's
yeah.
great. We're gonna give
And I've
you
been.
we got to give you sticker. David, we actually this is we'll cut this out, but we need to order stickers for HBus.
Oh yeah,
Yes,
that's
you
right. We
do.
do.
Yes, you do.
Yeah, or
I'm
Oh,
excited to see. Yeah, just from talking to people at conferences and like visits and stuff. Like you have a listener base, and I'm excited to see like at HBS to talk to people, see what they're thinking about it.
yeah,
Um,
this is a horrible. I can't believe Dan said that thing he said. But anyway, yes, enough of our sticker procurement sidebar. Apologies, Dan. So yeah, either
yeah.
Asian-based modeling and or what are you doing now?
I mean, I guess like, we could start with agent-based modeling, I guess. I mean, like the bigger picture thing. So, I mean, you say it like I'm doing a new thing. I don't really feel like I'm doing a new thing. I'm doing a thing that maybe people haven't done enough,
Mm,
but definitely like standing on the shoulders of giants. I mean, agent-based modeling is just one technique for formally modeling psychological hypotheses. It's a computer simulation technique where what you do is you simulate populations of autonomous entities, which we call agents. Autonomous just meaning they execute behaviors in some fashion. They do so according to decision rules that are inside their own head, and they execute those based on information that they capture from their own environment. So you just basically simulate a little kind of proto person with a little simple brain, put them in some kind of environment, and set them free to behave however they are going to behave. And this is really good for modeling all kinds of systems. It's especially good for modeling social systems. So situations where you think you have either some understanding of some bit of psychology and you want to know, if you put 100 people together that have this kind of mind, what's the sort of social phenomenon that's going to come out of that? Or a situation where you think you have a good understanding of the social phenomenon, but you're trying to reverse engineer
mm,
what individual level psychologies are sufficient to produce that so you can create a little silicon laboratory, right? um, and test out a bunch of different individual level psychologies and see which of them are sufficient to produce that social level phenomenon you're interested in. I'm not the first person to do this. I mean, I have certainly been inspired. Like I do this in the context of largely mating decisions, although as you know, Dave, have been branching out into other kinds of social partner decisions, things like group formation, friend choice. But there have been lots of people in the evolution and behavior space who have used similar kinds of models. I mean, I was super inspired as an undergrad, as we all probably were, by like, Axelrod's Prisoner's Dilemma tournaments. I was really inspired by the Blind Watchmaker. It's Blind Watchmaker, right? That was one of my favorite Dawkins books, and that's where he has the simulations where he's like evolving the different shapes to look like different animals. Um, uh, you know, working people like Jeffrey Miller and Peter Todd back in the day when they were doing agent-based models of big choice. And when I came across that, I was like, oh, this is how we should have been studying mating all along. Normally, he's done this similar work too. Of course, like Paul Smaldino, who I know you've had on the pod. So there's lots of people over time who have done this. It just like hasn't maybe caught on to quite the degree that I think it should.
mm. In agent-based modeling, it's really good for math is hard to represent lots of interactions and lots of factors. My understanding is in that with an agent-based model, to some degree, you can sort of look at the complex emergent things that you wouldn't be able to tell just by looking at, you stipulate the rules in each individual agent, but the properties, what ends up happening is not trivial or even predictable ahead of time, which is part of why you do it, would be my understanding in a way.
Yeah, I mean, I would say a couple things. One, agent-based modeling is a really good technique if you are interested in building formal models, but like me, are not particularly skilled at math.
Mm.
So, you get to, instead of having to like, set up and solve like a series of partial differential equations or something like that. You get to just sort of like you just have to specify the decision rules inside the agent's head, and then the computer handles the rest, right? Because it's all actual interactions between agents. And so a lot of the stuff that like a lot of the techniques that you would need for like uh, analytic models, you just sort of like offload to the computer, solve it by simulation, right? So that's part of why I got into it originally, because I was like, I want to do these kinds of things, but like I never took, beyond high school calculus. So um, at the time when I was a grad student, this was like the easiest way in. Um, but yeah, I do think there's virtue in that. Yeah, when you're trying to model systems that you think are the result of partially random, large numbers of partially random interactions between lots of parts, you can solve those things with math, but you have to make a lot of simplifying assumptions that uh, sort of push you further and further away from what you're actually trying to model. And I think in some senses, depending on your question, an agent-based model can be a more realistic representation of the system you're trying to study. That's not always a virtue, but sometimes I think it is.
Yeah. And it forces you to be explicit about things. Like I imagine as you're having a student, for example, come on, they um, I imagine it's a sort of thing of like, oh, I realize I have to specify this, I have to specify this, things that I didn't even really think about. I have to have an idea about how it works.
But yeah, I think that's a major virtue of formal modeling, period. And I think agent-based modeling is like, you know, no different from other modeling techniques in that it really draws these things out of you. And David, I know you've done also a lot of like formal. We were just talking about your paper, like a lot of formal modeling as well. I think this is a huge virtue of trying to formalize your hypotheses, your theories, period. I mean, I always tell students, yeah, like I've never sat down to write an agent-based model and not realized an assumption I didn't realize I was making. This is like just a universal process. And I think, it depends on how far you want to get into this, but like so much of our theorizing in psychology is purely verbal. And that's useful. It's, honestly, like we're humans, this is how we communicate. At some level, our hypothesizing needs to be verbal. Um, and you can get you can get much farther into a complicated idea when you're working with it purely verbally than if you try to formalize it at every step. Uh, but part of the trade-off with that is like, yeah, you're sort of relying on a lot of your intuitive machinery in ways that you don't necessarily realize you're doing. And so it's easy to, yeah, bake in assumptions that you're not realizing you're making, or be overly vague and broad in ways that give you lots of degrees of freedom for your hypothesis to appear as though it's explaining a lot of things. Um, and when you sit down and you have to say exactly what is the information that is available, exactly how is that processed into exactly what outputs, there aren't as many shortcuts. And so you sort of realize, I mean, I might have mentioned this last time. Did I talk about this last time I was on the podcast? I don't remember.
I don't know. I don't listen to the podcast. No, I don't remember. You were the first guest in, I think.
Is that right?
It was Jamie or you? I forget. Sorry, Jamie or you.
Better not have been Jamie.
I think it was Dan.
I think it was Dan.
That
Yeah, I
sounds
think this
right.
is
Yeah.
we're getting up on a year. So this is
That's
maybe
great.
maybe
That's,
you should be our 1 year episode. We'll see how it works out. I
I'll
don't
take
know.
that. I mean, part of my like whole entryway into doing all this stuff was, I was at the University of Texas. I was interested in mating psychology. Um, there was some work coming out around the time, including from Paul Eastwick, who was also at the University of Texas at the time. He was like the floor below us. So we were having these kind of like occasional interactions in the building. But there were these papers coming out that were we talked about the speed dating stuff last time. these speed dating papers that were like, can we predict what mate choices people will make in a live in-person interaction? And the answer was kind of no. And so there's all this like hullabaloo, like maybe our understanding of mating psychology is like totally wrong. We need to upend everything we know. Um, and I was sort of like skeptical that that was true. And I was like, there's maybe simpler explanations for why we struggle to predict people's choices in live interactions. And I was like, maybe, one explanation is just that um, I don't even remember where I started, but I was like, maybe one explanation is just that like people want lots of different things, right?
Mm.
Have
Yeah.
multiple different preferences. They've got to balance against them, and so maybe the person you met at the speed dating event who best met your kindness preferences was really far off your intelligence preferences, right? And so if we only look at like how much did the partner you chose match this one preference, we're missing those like trade-offs that people are making across dimensions. So it's like maybe that's what's going on. That feels intuitively true to me, but like, is that really sufficient to produce the kind of data that we're seeing in these speed dating studies? I just finished taking this like Monte Carlo analysis class that I had to take because it was like total serendipity. I like forgot to register for classes one semester, so the required stats class I needed to take filled up, and they wouldn't make an extra spot for me, and so I ended up taking this other stats class, and that like totally changed my life. Um, but I had just taken this like Monte Carlo analysis class, and I was like, oh, I could do one of the models that we do for that class. Like I could just like, make up some data that looks kind of like mate choice data. I could like simulate a process that looks kind of like what I'm thinking, like, people making choices across multiple dimensions. I could see what kind of data that makes across a large number of samples, and that would tell me, is this sort of process actually capable of producing this kind of data? I didn't even know, I'd never heard the word agent-based modeling at that time. Like I didn't know that this was a thing. I thought I was just kind of like hacking this together. So I started to try it out, and I was like, okay, so like I'll simulate some data that looks kind of like mate choice data. I sort of know what that looks like from the lab. And then, I need to have these agents. I didn't know they were called agents at the time. I was like, I need to have these like synthetic people, sort of meet with each other, and they need to like evaluate how attracted they are to one another, I guess, in order to like make a decision that they want to see each other again. So, oh shoot, like, okay, I can give them preferences, I can give them traits, but like, how do I make them decide from that how attracted they are to one another? Actually, like, crap, there's a lot of different ways you could do this. Like, maybe I could say the preferences are like a threshold, and if you're above a threshold, like, then you're attractive. That's how Peter Todd said it works. But maybe I can make it like a linear model where the preferences are like weights, and they sort of like a regression. They like multiply the trait by the preference and then add it all up. That's sort of like how David Buss has talked about it before. Oh man, like there's lots of different ways this could happen. I'd never thought about like this is an important part of the process that we haven't actually described how it works. And it wasn't until like I had to sit down and like make it happen in a computer that I realized like, oh, this is a linchpin assumption in how mate choice works that the entire field is just like not studying. So I think that's a key virtue of like forcing yourself to do these things. As you know, Dave, I now have in my lab, sort of like above the main meeting table, I have there's a famous quote, Richard Feynman from his chalkboard at the time of his death: "What I cannot create, I do not understand." And that's sort of like a core lab ethos. Like if you understand how some system works, you should be able to build a copy of it in a computer.
Mm. David, you were going to say something.
No, I mean it's just very, very cool stuff. So I'm curious, now that we have this background of agent-based modeling and we know your methodology, what kind of new stuff do you have cooking in the kitchen
Oh.
with this methodology? And it doesn't matter if it's uncooked, because we can come in and we can help.
Well, yeah. I feel like I'm being pushed in a certain
Yeah,
direction.
exactly. Yes.
Well, I mean, so Dave knows. I've got a big project that I've been working on for the last year or so. That's sort of putting together a collection of agent-based models on the evolution of sex and gender. This is something that's been on the back of my mind for like several years now. Um, just being very unsatisfied with not really knowing how to think about these concepts and not really feeling like there was clear guidance, at least that I'm aware of in the literature. And so it's mostly just an exercise of like me ironing out my own thoughts on these concepts, and then hopefully other people also find it useful and interesting. We'll see. Um, but yeah, I mean, I'm on sabbatical this year, so this was one of my like big sabbatical goals, was to finally push out like a big paper that's sort of like me just sketching out my thoughts on like what are sex and gender.
Hmm.
I mean, you
Do
guys are
you
the
view,
podcast hosts, but go ahead.
do you view them as so are you analyzing them together or as separate things or as interacting things? So how what are your thoughts there?
I was gonna ask you guys what your thoughts were. I
Yeah, I
mean, maybe
love
not
this.
David.
I remember there was like a point, I don't know how it was months ago, where you or Dan was going around and just like very wonderfully surveying. He's like, what do you think gender is? Like in a, like a clipboard and a pencil in hand, which I thought was lovely scientific method of just like, how would you define gender? Or is it different than sex? Yeah, what is it? Yeah.
That's
Yeah, well, now
interesting.
that now that we're like local colleagues, Dave knows this, but this is my gimmick for basically every project. Like you can always predict what I'm working on like 6 months in advance because at the bar I'll just start asking
Yes.
people, "What do you think about X?"
That's a fantastic way to do it. I love that. When did you start doing that?
I don't know. I think
Yeah.
it's just I don't know. I mean, maybe it was the fundamental attribution error, which is also something I need to write.
Yes, exactly. Your favorite. You're like,
Um,
I remember Dan in the hallway being like, what does the fundamental attribution error predict? Does it predict that internal versus external will be higher than like ordinally? Like, what's the relationship between those two?
yeah.
Or is it just that that your internal is going to be lower for another person than it is for yourself, but it doesn't matter what the absolute magnitude is between external and internal? Great questions. But anyway,
I mean, let me throw out a wrong idea. You can tell me why it's wrong. I
Yeah.
mean, I feel like part of the answer might be that, like, so sex, we already have a bunch of evolutionary models on the evolution of sex. It's about, differences in parental investment, operational sex ratio, potential reproductive rate, and these things lead to, the different sex roles we see throughout the animal kingdom. Gender is an interesting thing because it's a cultural thing. I would, as a first pass on like part of what's going on, it might be that you have sex, which represents these, parental investment, reproductive strategies. And then maybe gender is like how you signal this, because this thing isn't on the surface for other people to know,
Mhm.
like necessarily. Um, it could be how you signal your sex. So it could be kind of signaling equilibrium. It could be a kind of yeah. Maybe, let me start with that idea and
I
see what you
like that
think.
idea. I like that. And you would go straight to signal. That would be your
I
first.
would.
I like that idea, and I think that's actually pretty dang. I think you just got like 2/3 of the paper. Um, I mean, let me ask you. You guys are the hosts, but let me ask you that. I mean, I've asked David this before, so it's not fair. So maybe I'm asking just David. Like, what do you think is the average? If you ask the average psychologist what sex is, because you just said like, yeah, we have all these like evolutionary biological models, but like, do you think psychologists are aware of those?
Probably most psychologists are. I mean, it depends. I don't know. It depends on how familiar they are with evolutionary psychology in general. And I'll let Dave
Yeah,
I mean, I think
give
they
yeah.
his
would,
answer.
I think most people, I'll restate what I think. I think most psychologists would probably go like genitalia. Some would probably go genes, and a much smaller percentage would do gamete investment.
Yeah, yeah, and I think the first day Trump executive order, I think that's kind of shifted things a little bit. I was thinking about this project before that executive order, and that executive order really blew a hole in a lot of my thinking. Um,
And that was
uh,
the executive order that defined gender by
it didn't define gender at all.
oh, okay.
It yeah, it
It's
sort of
biology. Okay.
it doesn't quite say this, but it tries to erase gender as a concept entirely. That's my read of it, at least.
Okay.
But it defines, yeah, as being about it's complicated. We can get more into this, but it defines sex as being something about gamete size. So I think gamete size got onto a lot of people's minds much more than it had been before that executive order.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, my perspective on this, like, I'm a human mating researcher. Obviously, sex and gender are like really important concepts when you're thinking about, human relationships. And so, and I've, published on sex differences a lot. Like, these are things that I've been forced to think about it, at least in some degree. And, coming up as like a psychologist, you're sort of aware there are these concepts, sex and gender. They're supposed to be different things. You're supposed to talk about them differently. But when you try to like look at like what is the guidance that you get from psychologists about like what is sex itself and what is gender and why are those different things, I personally have never deeply understood what I was supposed to be talking about. And when I try to read the literature for like clear guidance on like what are the definitions or what are our models of these things, I find them really unsatisfying. So if you look at like definitions of sex in the literature, if you look at like the APA's guidance on like what sex is, I don't have it in front of me, but it's something like, sex is a person's biological status. That's a near direct quote, and I have no idea what that means. And it's, indicated by a number of traits, and they list off a number of traits that's like genitalia, gonads, sex chromosomes, hormones. They list off a number of indicators of sex, which I think is correct. Those things are indicators. They're not sex in and of itself. A lot of other psychologists will define sex as being like what chromosomes you have, which I think is crazy. Or like, they'll define sex as being like what sex you're assigned based on your genitalia, which I think is also like, I get what they're going for, but that's not quite right either. But yeah, like the APA's guidance, it doesn't say like what biological status of what. Like I have lots of statuses as a biological organism. Like what are we talking about when we talk about sex? Why are those things the indicators of sex? And they don't mention gamete size at all. The APA's definition of sex does not reference gametes at all. And I think that's a problem. One, because a lot of the things that psychologists focus on as being indicators of or definitions of sex are things that only apply to humans, right? Like sex chromosomes, they focus a lot on, do you have X or Y chromosomes? Do you have certain like, chromosomal disorders that lead to, different sex development disorders? It's fair enough for psychologists to be overly focused on humans, but like XY chromosomes, that's not definitive of sex across the diversity of life on this planet, right? Like that's how mammals do sex determination, but like birds don't have XY chromosomes, they have ZW chromosomes. Like lots of reptiles don't have sex chromosomes at all. Like they do sex determination just by temperature, right? So like there's a whole wider world of sex out there that is not determined by XY chromosomes. You wanted to define it in terms of genitalia, there's a whole diversity of genitalia out there, right? The way that we do genitalia is not the only way to do genitalia. You want to define it in terms of hormones, like plants have sexes, but don't have, at least hormones like we have. You could argue they have their own kind of hormones, but like they don't have testosterone, they don't have estradiol. So the definitions of sex that like psychologists use are really, really anthropocentric and don't capture like the concept of sex more broadly, which I think is a problem. Psychologists might think it's fine, but I think that's really unsatisfying. And then you think about gender, like what are definitions of gender? They're also just really vague. Like, people will say things like sex is biological and gender is like cultural. That's not, I hope that's not a too unfair gloss of a lot of ideas, but like, one, that irritates me because culture is biological, but two, it also irritates me because, and people will recognize this, like it's not clear where that boundary actually is. Like there are many things that there are ways in which things you might want to call cultural intersect with things you might want to call biological. And so where should you like delineate the boundary between what sex and gender becomes really unclear. And it's also just like not clear what gender is supposed to be. Like people will offer definitions of gender that are literally like, aspects of femininity. And it's like, what does that, how do I, we're just talking about like what I can't create, I don't understand. Like, how do I build a robot that has aspects of femininity? And also, like, if femininity is just how you refer to like womanness, then like it's totally circular. Like, there's no information in that definition as to what gender actually is. So I've been trying to sketch out sort of models, agent-based models, but also, agent-based models as representations of like theoretical ideas for like how should we as evolutionary psychologists think about these concepts? Are these different things? And if so, what are they? And hopefully that's also useful to like other psychologists more broadly. I've been writing this like long paper. It's way too long right now. I just finished like the very rough first draft on Tuesday.
Oh, nice.
These ideas are still like very actively cooking. Um,
Cool.
but part one is sort of like this rant I just gave, like what are sex and gender in the first place. Part two is kind of like sketching how I think we should think about sex, and part three is kind of sketching how I think we should think about gender.
Yeah, and Dan, you gave a talk at the Center for Evolutionary Psychology, and in addition to reinventing agent-based modeling when you were back in Texas, in your model, if I followed you, sort of re-derived the evolution of sex in your model, which was kind of cool. You started very much from like first principles.
Yeah, so I'm being a little self-indulgent, to be honest, in this project, which is partly contributing to its excessive length, and I know reviewers are probably going to hammer me for, but I just really want to do it. So yeah, what I'm trying to do, which I've never done before, is usually when you do agent-based models, you have a system that you want to model, you kind of like write the code for that, you create your little agents, you hit run, you let it run for a while. At some point it stabilizes, or you're just like sick of waiting for it to run, so you pause it, you have your little population, you analyze them, you report some figures and statistics in the paper, and you just kind of like freeze those agents in time forever, put them on a shelf, and like never really worry about them ever again. In this project, I'm trying to sort of work with a set of populations of agents throughout a variety of different models. And again, yeah, starting from first principles. So like the first question is like, why do we even have sex? So I build an agent-based model that is a sort of recapitulation of John Tooby's model of the evolution of sex. Like this turns out to be a major question that we still don't have like a super satisfying answer to. Like, why do we have sex in the first place? Why are we not all asexually reproducing organisms? Asexual reproduction just seems like the better way to reproduce. Like, you don't have to pay all the costs of searching for a mate. You certainly don't have to pay all the costs of like establishing and maintaining a relationship like we do. And if you're a gene inside an asexually reproducing organism's body, like, suppose your organism produces 2 offspring per generation, you're getting 2 copies of yourself per generation, right? But if you're a gene inside a sexually reproducing organism's body, right, every one of your offspring only have a 50% chance of inheriting you. So like, if the reproduction rate is fixed, like your replication rate as a gene is halved, right? Like, why would you do that? So there are some hypotheses out there. I think this might have been John Tooby's first paper. I keep saying that, but I need to verify that it's true. But like, he offered a model that at the time was novel. I think he got kind of unfortunate. He was a little bit unlucky in that W.D. Hamilton proposed a very similar model at the same
Yeah.
time. So I think Hamilton's version is the one that like most people know, but I'm going to credit it to John because he independently came up with it. But John's idea was that it has to do with pathogens, right? Like, so we're all in this, long-standing coevolutionary arms race with pathogens. They want to invade our bodies, consume our bodies to produce copies of themselves. That's good for their reproduction. It's bad for our reproduction. So we evolve defenses to try to keep them out. They evolve counter defenses to try to get in. That goes on forever. The problem for us is, as large-bodied, long-lived, slow reproducing organisms, pathogens reproduce much more quickly than we do, right? Like the pathogens that are in us right now can have, orders of magnitude more generations to adapt to our defenses than we have to evolve, new defenses. And so John's idea was that the function of sex is, if you're an asexual reproducing organism, you're invaded by some pathogen. It gets many generations to evolve, unique counter offenses to your defenses. So it's really good at exploiting your physiology. Then you produce offspring, which are genetic clones of yourself, right? To the extent that your defenses are heritable, the pathogens that are well adapted to you are immediately well adapted to infecting your offspring. And so you're never going to shake them off, right? But if you reproduce sexually, what you're doing is you're taking half of your genes, randomly scrambling them with half of David's genes. You're producing an offspring that is genetically similar to both of you, but is genetically unique, right? So the pathogens infecting, that are well adapted to either of you are no longer, perfectly adapted to invading your offspring. And so that, John argued, could be a sort of constant selection pressure that would favor the evolution of sexual reproduction over and above its sort of baseline costs. And you can build an agent-based model, simple agent-based model, where you simulate agents that are infected by a pathogen agent. They can reproduce asexually or sexually, and you can show if you turn up the dial on like how bad it is to be infected by a pathogen, there is a point eventually where selection will favor sexual reproduction over asexual reproduction. That doesn't have much to do with the rest of the project, but I just wanted to build an agent-based model of that idea because I love that idea.
Yeah, I mean, it's one of the great insights of evolutionary biology that, and it's one of the great mysteries of biology is why we sexually reproduce, and it's a particularly satisfying solution to that problem. And it's cool that you can cash it out mathematically in a model.
It's also a good
Anyway.
example of like asking a question you wouldn't ordinarily think. I think it's a great example of like even seeing the mystery there at all and not just assuming, well, of course there's sex and just taking it for granted.
Yeah.
And I like it's like a nice example of like like pathogens seem like such a window dressing thing from like a modern everyday perspective. Like that's what Lysol's for. Like the idea that like we're built around the fact that pathogens exist. I think to a very modern intuition, it feels like, oh, pathogens, whatever. That's like the stuff in the carpet. I do, I build rockets. It's like, no, you are designed around and to defeat pathogens. And you have to take the world is much more powerful. Even the microscopic world is much more powerful than you might think.
Yeah.
So anyway, were you going to continue with the journey? So we got the evolution of sex comes from viruses. What's the next step here?
Yeah. So I mean, that gives us sexual reproduction, right? So then what I do is I take those agents that have now evolved sexual reproduction, and we ask, well, where do sexes come from, right? Why would there be sexes given that there's sexual reproduction? And so here I'm just like, again, the whole like first part of this paper is like recapitulating models by people smarter than me, but trying to do them in a sort of unified and simplified way. So here I'm building off of models by people like, Coco and Parker and, again, Tubi and Cosmides. Honestly, Lita was angry at me for not including her model in the draft I presented to the CEP, but it'll make it into the paper. In the supplement probably, but it'll be there. So, the question is, why do we have sexes? And earlier, David, I mean, you gave a definition of sexes in terms of like differences in parental investment and operational sex ratio and stuff like that. I don't think that stuff is actually sex either. I think those things are things that importantly follow from sex, but they're not like definitive of what sex is. And I think like biologists have roughly known this answer for a long time, but psychologists just don't know about it. So I see this part of the paper as like just communicating the established biology to psychologists. Where does sex come from? Well, if you reproduce sexually, the way you do it is you produce gametes, sex cells, right? Those contain some kind of genetic payload that's like, these are the genes that I want my offspring to be constructed from, as well as some just like general cellular machinery and like energy and nutrient stores that like allow the cell to function. Those gametes fuse together. And, if that fusion is successful, if there's enough energy and nutrient stores, if there's like the correct kind of machinery, then that fused zygote can develop into an offspring, right? So there's some probably like minimal investment that each sort of parent organism needs to make. Like if you each put in, there's some minimum investment a zygote needs to be successful, if each parent puts in, 50% of that into the zygotes, when those zygotes fuse, they have some probability of success, right? The way the model works is sort of built off of that kind of assumption. We're assuming there's some kind of like minimum sort of energy threshold that a zygote needs to be able to develop successfully into an organism when two gametes fuse, right? That said, as long as both parents put in that sort of 50% minimum, there's some probability of zygote success, but there's inevitably going to be variation in how much parent organisms invest in their gametes, right? And that variation is going to have consequences, right? There's going to be a inevitable sort of quality quantity trade-off in gamete production. So I can put more energy and nutrients into each of my gametes. That is probably going to increase the likely success of those gametes in developing into successful offspring. But if each of those gametes is more expensive, that means I can't afford to produce as many of them given a fixed energy budget, right? So I can make bigger, more nourishing gametes, but the consequence of that is I'm not going to have as many reproductive opportunities. On the other hand, I can sort of cheap out. I can make smaller, less nourishing gametes. They're going to be less likely to develop into successful offspring when they fuse with others. But the upside is by investing less into each gamete, I can afford to make more of them with a fixed budget. Right? And this is again like very inspired by Dawkins, right? The description of the evolution of sex, I think, in The Selfish Gene kind of follows exactly this logic. He was also sort of basing this off of like Parker's ideas. So you could think one potentially optimal strategy is everybody just invests 50%. But another potentially optimal strategy is you can make lots of really small gametes, which provide very little investment into the resulting offspring, but give you lots and lots of opportunities to produce offspring. And you can make those gametes such that they specifically target relatively large partners. And that sort of balances the costs and benefits of both extremes of that investment trade-off, right? If you make lots of small gametes that specifically target large gametes, then your offspring are relatively likely to be successful because they're targeting gametes that provide the energy and nutrients that you're not providing, but you get lots of reproductive opportunities. So you can set up, we take those agents that have evolved sexual reproduction. Now they make gametes. They have a gene that regulates, do you make big or small ones? They have a fixed energy budget. And they have another gene that regulates like what size of gamete do your gametes target. And you can start off this population where there's like uniform, whatever initial distribution of gamete production you want. But you can start it off where there's like a uniform distribution of gamete size. Kick that off, and very rapidly what you see is the evolution of a bimodal distribution in gamete size, where there's some individuals that specialize in producing as small of gametes as they can that target partners that are as large as they can, and then there's other individuals that specialize in producing relatively large gametes, and there's not very much selection on their preferences. And so that is the evolution of sexes, right? And I think that's how we need to think about sexes. What sex is there is this inevitable quality quantity trade-off in gamete production. This is, by the way, a part where I'm still trying to work out the language of the argument. But there is this inevitable quality quantity trade-off in gamete production. There is, given the details of a particular species like life history and ecology, there are going to be some optima in terms of where you fall on that trade-off distribution. So there are isogamous species out there. There are species where the optimum is everybody contributes the same amount to their gametes. All gametes are equally sized. There are no sexes, or maybe I would like to say there's just one sex. But there are a large number of species where the optima are just the two extreme ends of that trade-off distribution, right? Like one optimum is produce gametes basically as small as you can. The other optimum is produce gametes basically as large as you can. And those optima is what I want to argue is what we should think of as the sexes for that species.
Dan, can I ask, from an intuitive perspective, like already existing as a huge human, it feels like the investment in gametes is trivial, even when they're large.
Yeah.
Is the idea that phylogenetically, i.e., over evolutionary time, for even small critters, that really was a big investment or a big investment difference, And then there's a bunch of concomitant differences that follow from that change in investment, such that, the generally speaking, there's obligate investment on the larger gamete producer. Is the idea that it's sort of a timing thing in the sense of the gamete difference came first, and then the big macroscopic sex differences or dimorphisms came later? Because from the again from like the like it would be trivial for me as an adult male if I could physiologically to produce an egg. Like that's
Yeah, yeah.
nothing, right? But we're talking about it as if it's this enormous difference. But I think that might be a biased perspective, or like I think you know what I mean. But that's sort of the question. I think people might be wondering when they're hearing that, and I'm wondering it too. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think a lot of psychologists are going to wonder that. Like, I
Yeah.
want to communicate this to like a broader psychological audience than just evolutionary psychologists. So I do think that's like that will be an issue. And I mean, we're also like immediately falling into assuming I always forget the term for this, but like a gonochoric species where it's like either as an individual you specialize in
Yeah,
one
and
type
that's
of
right.
gamete
Yeah, no,
or another.
totally. Yes,
But
yes,
that
yes,
need not
yes.
be the case. There's
No,
lots of
that's right.
organisms like
Yep. Yeah,
lots of
hermaphroditic
flowers
species. Yeah,
where
exactly.
yeah,
Yeah, yeah,
lots of fish where you can do both at the same time or
yeah,
either a different point in
yeah.
time. So
My bias is showing. My species, I'm a
yeah.
speciesist. Yeah.
But yeah, I mean the argument is that we're talking about sort of very early evolution of sex. Yeah, at a time when gamete production would be like a more sizable chunk of your overall energy budget. Um, and I think what happens is that the reason why this bimodality in gamete production matters is because that does set up other selection pressures for the kinds of things that you're talking about, David, which themselves shape other aspects of phenotype that we should care about, including as psychologists. So those are kind of the subsequent models. So we start with, okay,
Mm.
we had evolution of sexual reproduction. We move on to evolution of sex. We do produce these like gonochoric agents that I hope that's the right word that are producing either really large or really small gametes. Then I take those same populations and start introducing new selection pressures. So now, the first one I do, I think, is we can introduce a gene that regulates like investment in sort of costly mate competition. You can think of it as. So if you're high on this particular gene, then what happens is like you're more likely to die before you get to produce gametes. But if you do produce gametes, like your gametes are basically at the front of the line when it comes for fertilization. So you get earlier reproductive opportunity. You're less likely to reproduce, but if you do get to reproduce, you get to reproduce first, right? Um, that's distributed, uniformly throughout the population, independent of gamete size. But we can ask, like, well, what would selection do with that in a world where there are some individuals that are specializing in producing large numbers of small gametes and other individuals that are specializing in producing small numbers of large gametes? Well, if you're producing small numbers of large gametes, the sex ratio is in your favor. There's lots of small gametes out there. You're virtually guaranteed that like all of your gametes are going to get fertilized, assuming an equal ratio of those two morphs. Uh, and so, you know, dying before you get to reproduce, just to make sure that you get to reproduce first, like that doesn't have any benefit to you. And so selection should really strongly select against that kind of like risky, costly mate competition among those individuals. But if you're a small gamete producer, right, there's lots and lots of small gametes out there. They're all competing over a smaller number of large gametes. So making sure that your gametes get to the large gametes first, like that's a huge bottleneck in terms of your reproduction. And so it's worth trading off a little bit of your survivability to make sure that if you do get to produce gametes, your gametes actually get to develop into an offspring. And so selection should favor those kinds of costly competition genes in the small gamete producers. And that's exactly what happens in the models, right? You can start off these populations where these competition genes are uniformly distributed, independent of gamete production strategy, and they very quickly evolve into this sort of sex differentiated mating strategy where small gamete producers are investing in costly mate competition, large gamete producers are not. You can do the reverse. So at the same time, introduce what I'm calling like a parenting gene. This parenting gene, if you're high on it, It costs you some of the energy that you use to produce gametes, so you can't make as many gametes if you're high on this parenting gene. But it increases the probability that if you produce a gamete, that gamete actually survives, right? And so we can again distribute that uniformly throughout the population, and we can ask, well, what would selection do with that? Well, if you reason it through, if you're a large gamete producer, right, you have relatively few reproductive opportunities. The population can only support so many offspring. We stipulate that as an assumption. So if one of your offspring, dies because you're, over carrying capacity or something, like that's a huge chunk of your reproductive success. It's probably worth, producing slightly fewer offspring in order to make sure that all of your offspring actually survive to the next generation. Whereas if you're a small gamete producer, like you don't even know if you're going to get to produce an offspring at all, right? Because the sex ratio is not in your favor. And if you do, you're probably going to produce a lot of them. So any one offspring is probably a relatively small chunk of your overall reproductive success. So it probably makes sense to just focus on buying as many lottery tickets as you can and just hoping they all work out rather than, limiting your reproductive opportunities and keeping those alive. And that's exactly what happens in the model, right? At the same time that selection is favoring mate competition in the small gamete producers, it favors the evolution of these like costly parenting adaptations in the large gamete producers. So these are things that I think have been argued like kind of intuitively, and they've been formally modeled before too. But like we're showing in sort of one model system now. We're starting with the evolution of sex, getting to sexes, and now showing like sex differences in these other like mating and parenting phenotypes that follow directly from this bimodality in gamete production.
Yeah, it's amazing. It's a good example too of people always, accuse, well, not always, that's hyperbole, but often accuse just so stories, right? Where it's sort of like, well, it could have gone either way, but then there's just a post hoc story.
Mhm.
And it's a lovely example of you literally are specifying the world as equal. And it's showing that, given there's deductive logic to differential reproductive success. So yeah.
Yeah, and like these things are, you know, I think part of what these models illustrate is these things are really contingent on the assumptions that you make. So
Yeah.
I don't want I don't want to like give the impression that like these sex differences are like the inevitable consequence of having sexes. Like these kinds of things are like the essence of maleness or the essence of femaleness. Like there are species out there that don't show these patterns, right? Like phalaropes are the classic example. They're these birds where like it's the females that are big and colorful and compete over access to the males. But you can explain those kinds of outcomes within the same sort of model system, right? So one of the key variables that regulates the evolution of these traits that we've already been talking about is the sex ratio. So the way
Mm.
I'd set up these models is that there's an equal sex ratio, right? There's an equal number of large gamete producers and small gamete producers. But if you change that assumption, if you change the environment, so like I have a version of the model where like, you can assume this does happen. Like, let's assume for whatever reason, the large gamete producers are like really broadly dispersed throughout the environment. Like resources are really patchy, let's say. They're really sparse and patchy, and so the large gamete producers are like spread out over like a really large, uh, you know, physical space. So if you're a small gamete producer and you want to reproduce, like you've got to travel really long distances between these patches. That's going to slow down your reproductive rate, right? Even if there's an equal number of large and small gamete producers, if it just takes a long time to travel between patches of potential mates, that's going to necessarily slow down your reproductive rate. If you model that kind of system where, yeah, if you're a small gamete producer, you can produce a lot of gametes, but you can't necessarily use all of them just because of travel time. Um, then you can actually see the reversal of that like competition difference. You can see evolution favoring high competition in the large gamete producers,
Mm.
higher competition in the large gamete producers and the small gamete producers. So it's not like these things. That's why earlier, David, I was saying like I don't think these things like differences in parental investment. They aren't sex in and of themselves. They're things that follow from sex. Right? Like what sex is doing is it's acting as kind of like a moderator variable that is shaping like how does your ecology lead to particular phenotypes?
Hmm.
Cool.
Interesting. I mean, it's the phalarope example is a lovely example. It's an exception that proves the rule. Um, but it's interesting because you see what's called a sex role reversal.
Mm.
Um, do you think does it make sense to think of phalaropes, their different parental investment strategies is that sex, Like, given that the males are investing a lot and the females are competing over the males, should we flip it around and say that the males are females in some sense?
It's a good question,
Yeah.
and this is like kind of where I lost the Center for Evolutionary Psychology is like, what are the implications for all of this in terms of how we should think about like what sex is? I mean, I should say there's another model. It doesn't super matter for this conversation, but there is another model after this where I'm modeling like sex differences in mating strategies. So we add like another gene that's kind of like a mating parenting trade-off gene that regulates like, do you pursue lots of mating opportunities and do not very much parenting, or do you do like more, do you spend more of your time on parenting and less of your time pursuing mating opportunities? And the sex difference you expect does evolve in this kind of context, assuming relatively equal sex ratio. But then if you crank up the strength of selection on a parental investment, if you're a species like us that produces like highly altricial offspring that really benefit from having biparental care, then what you see is selection favors sort of lots of parenting and not very much mating in both the large and small gamete producers. And so that's how you can get like the evolution of like pair bonding and biparental care. Um, so yeah, the point is like sex shapes these phenotypes, but it doesn't inevitably lead to particular phenotypes, right? So yeah, what does that mean for how we should think about sex? Yeah, should we call like the big colorful phalaropes the males, or should we stick to like gametes as defining what the sexes are? I think we should stick to gametes because I think if you want to try to define sex in terms of these manifest phenotypes, like there's all kinds of phenotypes out there. Like there's not going to be like what is universal across all of these species is gamete production, right?
Mm.
These particular phenotypes are really particular to this species ecology and phylogenetic history and life history. And so if we want to be making like bespoke definitions of sex based on phenotypes, like we're going to need lots of really complicated definitions. Whereas, I think gamete size is like a clean, universally applicable definition. But I think if we want to do that, we need to like, there are some things we're going to have to give up, which is, I think if we want to be serious about gamete production as being core to sex, I think the argument I want to make is that like what sex is it's not really a variable that properly exists at like approximate level of analysis. It's not something that's in the organism itself. What sex is, it's a set of reproductive strategies, right? It's these optimal gamete production strategies that selection is always pushing organisms toward. But any individual organism is always going to be some kind of noisy approximation of those optima. And those optima are going to have lots of consequences for the kinds of phenotypes that evolve. But there's no one element in that phenotype that is the organism's sex. So I think like we find it very useful to perceive the world in a way that like there are males and there are females, and that organism is a male and that organism is a female, because sex does exist. It does have these effects on phenotypes. It does structure, the covariance matrix of phenotypes such that like certain bundles of adaptations tend to go with some organisms and other bundles of adaptations tend to go with others. So it's like a useful hallucination to see sex in the real world, but like I think it's a hallucination, right? I think if we really want a proper scientific understanding of what sex is, we need to understand that like it's these abstract conceptual optima. It's the designs that selection is pushing towards. It's not anything that's in the physical organism's body.
Interesting.
That's where like people are like,
Yeah, no, it's great. Yeah. I mean, I think it's all, I mean, it sounds like it's something similar. I was thinking while you were talking, like other analogies, excuse me. And things like risk taking or being not risk taking are also sort of these abstractions. But then again, of course, like risk taking can vary by situation. And something like sex, there are the hermaphroditic species where it's sort of, both, but it's not as facultative or situational specific, it seems. I mean, so I think it's also a trick of our evolved psychology probably having strong biases about having entries for sex, basically. I think is probably part of why we're having trouble as scientists thinking about it the right way as this abstraction or in design space or sort of a set of dynamics in design space.
Yeah. And I think there's really good reasons why we intuitively feel that way, which is
Yeah.
part of like the gender stuff. Um, but yeah, I think we need to like sort of fight our intuitions. And I think it's fine to have those intuitions. I'm not saying like you in your everyday life need to
Yeah.
like stop thinking about people as having sexes, but I'm just saying like as scientists, if we want to have like an accurate model of these things, we need to understand that like our intuitions are sort of leading us in the wrong direction and that like really what's going on. I think we should think about sex more in the same way as we think about like something like species. Like
Mm.
it's useful to categorize organisms into species. Like there are real evolutionary histories that cause, humans to be different from chimpanzees. It's a consequence of like, certain facts about the evolutionary history of those organisms. Um, and it's a really useful concept. Like if I say that's a chimp, that tells you a lot about the kinds of things you can expect to find in that organism versus if I tell you that it's a human. But there's nothing in a chimp that like is its chimpness, right? There's no like one thing you could put your finger on that's like all chimps have this and everything that's not a chimp
Mm.
doesn't have this, right? Like it's just a useful shorthand for saying like this is the evolutionary history of this particular individual is X.
Right.
Uh,
So
sex is
hmm. Can I take a stab at defining sex?
yeah, yeah,
So,
please.
is this right? It's the set of adaptations that tend to evolve as a function of gamete size.
I wouldn't say it's the adaptations.
No. Okay.
Yeah, because then I think you do get into like, well, phalarope sex is different than like human sex, and I
That's why I
think
said
that's like,
tend to, not necessarily. I mean, there are exceptions like Fowler, but it's set of adaptations that tend to evolve as a function of
uh,
gamete size.
I really want to avoid tend to.
Oh, okay. All right. All right.
I mean,
Indicated by,
Corrected.
indicated by. Kidding, that was a
well, I
joke.
mean,
That was a
Tend
I
joke.
want
to,
to
That
hear
was
where
in
you were
most
going with
cases,
indicated
that.
by.
evolve, but with some exceptions.
No, David, you good job taking a stab at this. This is good.
All right. All right.
We just in
I mean,
love, but yes.
I want to hear where you're going with that, but that's part of why I want to push towards like what sex is these optimal trade-off points in the quality quantity trade-off in gamete production, right? Like no matter what kind of sexually reproducing species you are, you have to make some sort of decision about how much you invest in each of your gametes. That's going to have some costs and benefits in terms of sort of the quality versus quantity of gametes you can produce. There's going to be some set of optima given the details of your species.
Hmm.
It's often going to be one or two optima. That just seems to be what happens.
Got it.
Um, so what sexes are, like the sexes are those optimal trade-off points.
Got it.
So
Okay. So the sex
yeah.
is the gametes, and you're either big or small gametes, basically.
Can I poke? I think if Dan, it's that
Yeah.
sex is a set of selection pressures given certain stipulations about the world, in this particular case, largely being gamete trade-off. So it's a set of selection pressures driving phenotypes, but it's those selection pressures specifically predicated upon gamete trade-offs.
I think that's a lot closer. And that might be right. I'm a little nervous about saying it's selection pressures itself. I
Mm,
think I want to say it's the design that selection is pushing toward, which might
got
be
it.
equivalent. But it's
Yeah.
the optima toward which selection is pushing. Those are the
Hmm.
sexes. That's
Okay. Yeah. 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 Yeah,
It's
that is
it's
very it's like physics where it's not intuitive. We don't have an intuitive entry for an object in that kind of model, right?
all
Like
right.
that's great. Yeah.
Sex is the set of adaptations that specialize in either large or small gametes.
I'm a little bit nervous. I mean, maybe I'm just a little bit
Yeah.
nervous to define it in terms of the adaptations because, like, how do you then define what those adaptations are, especially across species that do it in lots of different ways?
Specifically the gamete is the adaptation.
The
So
Just the
argument,
gamete. Yeah.
or, or would it be the argument that there's evidence of special design that those phenotypic features are the result of the gamete associated selection pressures, which is maybe just a way of redescribing what you're saying, Dan.
Um, it could be, and then I think it gets really what is sex becomes super contentious. It becomes like super contingent on like states of evidence for like special design for certain things.
Mm.
Um,
So are you thinking of it just in the simplest possible way as just big or small gametes?
kind of. I mean, I
Yeah.
do want to be open to the possibility that it's not just big or small. Like I do think it seems to be very often those are the kind of like most stable optima, and certainly there are isogamous species where it's like all one
Mm.
kind. But in principle, like we can imagine we go to like an alien planet, and for whatever reason, the optima are like there's three gamete sizes that kind of work out, or four gamete sizes that kind of work out. I don't know. Um,
Yeah.
Or maybe cheap or expensive gametes.
I think that's how it seems to often work.
Mhm.
Um, but that's why I'm trying to like push it out to like it's not a particular sex is not a particular manifestation, right? Like what sex is just like whatever are the optima for this particular species, right? Like
Mhm.
and very often the optima are cheap or expensive or big or small. Um, but
It-
in principle it could be something else.
So it's the equilibrium for
Yeah,
selection on gamete size.
exactly.
Right.
Exactly.
So
Okay,
if
I
there was
got
this,
it.
yeah, so yeah, that's great. So if there was a
Yeah.
species that was produced big gametes or small gametes facultatively or every other day of the week, it would be one sex because that's the universal. Um, uh,
Well, you're talking about like a sequentially hermaphroditic species. I think I would say there's two sexes there. It's just you like individuals alternate between the sexes. But that's maybe really getting into semantics.
okay.
Like
Okay.
I
Yeah.
don't
I
do
should
want
have.
to know
I
about
we
sex.
edited out my last comment because David had a nice wrap that up nicely. David, can you repeat that? What was that again?
Sure. I believe how I framed it's the equilibrium uh, of the selection pressures on gamete size.
Yeah, yeah,
All right.
yeah. It's
Very.
the
That
set
is
of
specific
strategies in
to
the equilibrium.
yeah. It is the specific yes
Yeah.
that is specific to a species.
Great. Put that on a Hallmark card. Okay, so now
All
we
right.
figured
So
out sex.
okay, hold on. I think there's one more because what I was thinking. So there's also sex roles, which is I think
Hmm.
different from gender. So what I was thinking of in terms of, potential reproductive rate, parental investment, stuff like that, that tends to follow from gamete size,
Yeah,
but doesn't
yeah,
always, as in the case of the
yeah,
phallorrhopes.
yeah.
And so you have sex, which is the equilibrium selection pressure on gamete size. And then you have the sex roles, which tend to follow from that equilibrium, but do not always follow. And sex roles would be something like parental investment, intrasexual competition, stuff like that.
I think that's right. Yeah,
Okay.
yeah. And I think they do follow. It's just it's not a one-to-one mapping of like
Yeah.
gamete size to a particular role. It's just gamete size dictates. It's very likely that there will be some kind of sex role, and gamete
Yeah.
size is one force that dictates what the sex roles will look like.
Got it. Okay. So we got sex, we got sex role. Now let's move on to gender.
Yeah. So what is gender and why do we have it? This is like so that whole part, the whole first part is just like recapitulating what evolutionary biologists have already said for the most
Yeah.
part. Maybe that equilibrium thing is like that's my like tinfoil hat edition. Um, but gender, I think, is something that has been way under theorized. In part because it turns out it's like a really new concept. I was not really aware of this. Like like the first reference to gender as a concept separate from sex was from a psychiatry paper in like 1955 or something like that. Like people have not really been thinking about these, at least in technical ways. People have not been thinking about these as separate concepts for all that long. And like I said, the definitions are really vague and I think unhelpful. Um, so the definition I've been trying to sketch out for gender is like what gender is a sort of set of folk theories about how sex manifests in your particular ecology. So why do we need these folk theories? Why can't we just know like if sex leads to sex roles? Why can't we just be like born knowing like okay these are human sex roles? This is my sex. I'm gonna enact this role. I think it has something to do with like our species' unique distribution and foraging niche, right? Like, so we are really widely dispersed, hyper generalist foragers, right? Like, humans live in all, inhabitable ecologies on this planet plus Canada, and
And New
we
Jersey, and New Jersey.
and New Jersey, and we, wherever we are born, wherever we migrate, we just like figure out how to extract food from that ecology. Um, and we tend to specialize in the things that are hardest to extract, right? We tend to specialize in things like, big game, which is very, calorie and nutrient dense, but really doesn't want to provide those calories and nutrients. And so it's very difficult to extract. Or we, rely on these like difficult to extract gathered goods, like, like tubers and honey and stuff like that, that requires like great skill and technology and time to extract, and also potentially great skill, technology, and time to process into something that we can eat. But in exchange, we get these like huge energy packages that both require but also feed this like big expensive brain that we have, right? So this is all like known. I'm like standing on the shoulders of like anthropological giants here. Like this is all very much inspired by like Kaplan and Lancaster and Hill and Hurtado and stuff like that. Um, so I think we have this unique foraging niche where, if you're a gene inside of a human infant body, right? Like your organism opens its eyes for the first time. It doesn't know where on this planet it's been born. It doesn't know like what kind of like, how do my people make their way in this world, right? Like what kind of food? Are we primarily fishers? Are we primarily large game hunters? Are we, industrialized Americans and we primarily eat like processed fast food? Like, where does my food come from? I think is a major question. And I think that's a major question because that shapes all kinds of other aspects of life, right? Like how you subsist in the ecology where you've been born, like that shapes how you spend your time, right? It shapes what technologies you invest time learning into. It invests like what skills do you try to build up over a lifetime. It shapes, how do you live? Like, are you sedentary or are you very mobile? What kinds of relationships do you have with others? Do you have like, risk pool sharing, or do you have like just like, individual reciprocity? Like all of these things are shaped by the ecology that you have been born into, heavily by like the ways that that ecology, affords you getting your food. And so humans have to be able to learn how to do all those things. They have to be able to learn like what do I eat in this ecology, and how does that shape all the rest of it. From the Martin Daly interview you guys did, he was talking about like one of his first postdocs was in a lab that was like a socioecology lab, um, which I don't think I'd actually heard the name of that discipline before, but I looked it up and it's like, the study of how like ecology shapes, social structures. And I thought like, that's perfect. Like, I think like because of our unique foraging niche, like humans basically have to be like intuitive socioecologists, right? You need to be able
Mm.
to like look around in the place that you've been born and ask yourself like, what's my ecology and how does that shape how people live their lives here?
Mm.
I think that's just a question that humans need to ask.
Hmm.
Um,
It's
and so I
interesting.
think we need
So,
this. Oh, go ahead.
so just to, sorry, that's an interesting thought you just had. So socioecology tends to study the relationships between ecology and social structure that emerge over evolutionary time. But what you're saying is that those relationships between ecology and social structure in humans emerge over the span of a few generations rather than evolutionary time because humans learn how to adjust their social structure to their ecology. So it's a similar discipline in that it's still mapping ecology to social structure, but the mapping arises over ontogenetic time as opposed to evolutionary time.
Yeah, yeah, that's exactly right. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think like this is what, forager studies is all about. This is so much of what like cultural evolution is all about.
Right.
I think like these things are well established and there's like good literature to draw in there that like, yeah, like the ways in which people tend to live their lives are heavily structured by, in large part, the ways that they get their food, which is structured by like the ecologies they happen to live in. And there are, I think the adaptations, the psychological adaptations underlying these things, this is where evolutionary psychologists could do better, like mapping out how those adaptations actually work. But there are clearly adaptations for like, learning how to produce, technologies that are going to be useful in your particular ecology, or, learning how to flexibly deploy different kinds of foraging strategies or different kinds of cooperation strategies, depending on, the structure of the environment you happen to live in. So I think, the variations in our ecologies generates this variation. So now there's an adaptive problem. If you're a human, you need to figure out like, what is my, what does life look like in my population? This is something you can maybe help me like workshop this, because I've been trying to figure out a way to describe this. Because I feel like as I describe this to people, what they take away is like, oh, so you're saying gender is about learning how to forage. That's not really the argument I'm trying to make. The argument I'm trying to make is variability in foraging generates variability in all these other aspects of life.
Mm,
That's what you need to learn. Like you need to
right.
learn how to live your life given, the way that foraging generates variation. So I'm kind of been trying to think of a name for like what's that set of things that like vary potentially as a function of like your ecology or foraging. I'm currently thinking like lifeway as sort of like an homage to like Kelly's foraging spectrum, the lifeway of hunter-gatherers. Like as a baby human, like a pressing problem for you is like you need to learn like what is the lifeway for people like me? Like what foods do I eat? What technologies do I need to master? What skills do I need to master? How do I need to relate to other people so that I can, successfully capture energy from this environment and turn it into offspring, basically. Uh,
Dan, can I ask? This is a question that's also, though, maybe helping maybe in that articulation. Is one way of putting it, because David, I always think about David's notion of status games, is one way of thinking about it is that the status games that are in a community are not arbitrary, but they're sort of tethered to resources and therefore the ecology. So
yes.
that's another way I think of putting the same thing, right? Like that sort of
Yeah.
there's this tethering between the status games that can exist, what counts as being good or bad, or what the games are. There can be some proliferation, some elaboration, but ultimately there's some feedback from the ecology and the resources, because ultimately that's really where the rubber hits the road.
I think that's exactly right. Yeah. And I think importantly, we could be the kind of species, we could be multiple different species, right? And I think, that's what racists think, right? Like we could be like, there's an African morph and there's an Asian morph, and like, it could be that like you're just born knowing like, oh, I'm Asian, therefore I eat these kinds of things, therefore these are the sort of status games. But
Right.
that's just not how human genetics works, right? Like
Yeah.
there's huge gene flow across human
Yeah.
populations. And so there is this variation that's tethered to ecology, but it's also importantly, because there's constant interaction between different human populations, there's constant gene flow across different
Right.
populations. That variation is
Mm,
unpredictable from the gene's eye view. It's again, I'm going back to Dawkins. It's like
yeah.
it's the Aver Andromeda problem that he talks about in Selfish Gene, right? Like the genes need to build one psychology that can work in any kind of ecology. It doesn't know what that ecology is going to look like in advance, and so it needs to build a learning program that can like
Right.
look around in its ecology and say, well, this is how my people seem to live, so I'm gonna do the same.
Yeah, that's
Uh,
amazing. Yeah, and it really suggests like a very rich this is very much about the development then, and it really suggests like a very rich unexplored psychology of resources, ways of making a living, status. And these are not the right words because we don't have the words in our natural language, but it suggests that. And I think some developmental psychologists have studied these kinds of things, but I
yeah,
think, this is amazing because yeah, it sounds like it's really opening up this idea of yeah, I hear what you're saying that you're sort of looking at like what's the way of making a living, broadly
mhm.
speaking, but fleshing that out in a way that you could implement it in a little critter, a software critter is that's cool. Yeah, that's a hard yeah, but a good. It's fruitful. Like I can start imagining ways of doing that. Yeah.
Yeah, I wouldn't say it's unexplored. Like I feel like
Yeah.
developmental psychologists have been studying this and anthropologists have been studying this for a long time, but maybe just not organized as like this is the sort of unified, this is the elephant that we're all trying to
Right.
describe.
Right.
Um, so I mean, where does gender come from in this though? Like I'm just talking about
Yeah.
like, learning life ways. I think because of sex, because sex does shape phenotypes in ways that we've already talked about, those phenotypes that follow from sex are going to have implications for that life way, right? And we know this from lots of anthropological research, right? Like one major aspect of this is like some individuals have high levels of obligate childcare in the form of internal gestation and lactation. That's going to make certain forms of foraging
Mm.
more difficult in some ecologies, right? It's like difficult and dangerous to, large game hunting in some ecologies if you have to, breastfeed an infant on demand. Um, and Kaplan and Lancaster and colleagues, they have like these really nice models that show like because large game hunting is so skill intensive, and because of the amount of time that like a sort of like natural fertility woman would spend pregnant or breastfeeding, um, like it's just not worth the investment to try to build up the skills to do large game hunting. Like it's a much better use of your time to focus on other resources than it is to try to invest in those skills. And so they argue like this is why you get sexual divisions of labor that you see across many foraging societies. Like it's just a more efficient arrangement for everybody if males focus on these activities that are not very compatible with childcare because they have lots of time to build up the skills to make that a worthwhile investment, and females invest more in other activities that are more compatible with childcare demands. So I think uh, sex is going to shape optimal life ways, but it's going to do so in unpredictable ways across ecologies, right? In some ecologies, maybe sex won't matter that much, right? Like if you're primarily a fishing population, like anybody can fish a lot of the time. It depends on the details of your ecology is the point. So it's very likely if you're, an infant human, it's very likely that you live in a place where there's sex differences in your this kind of like life way. But the nature of those sex differences is going to be opaque to you. So part of learning this life way is my argument is like probably a more efficient way of learning this life way is if you do have this kind of conceptual slot already, if you're born with an expectation that there are probably different life ways based on your gamete production strategy, and you can learn different life ways from different models, then you can deploy a life way that like works best for you. And so I think what gender is like your models of like what is the life way in my particular ecology separated by, sex.
Awesome.
And we can
Interesting.
model this.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
interesting.
So, oh, go ahead. Go
Presumably,
ahead.
there's also a psychological dimension to the downstream consequences of gamete size. You mentioned that, among males, they might accept a lower survival probability in exchange for a greater reproductive potential. And so that might manifest at the level of psychology with greater appetite for risk-taking and dangerous
Yeah.
activities among
Yeah.
men, that they're willing to trade off some survival risk for a large reproductive payoff, potentially in status or whatever.
Yeah.
And so that could be another variable that affects these life ways. And so it's not merely that men don't have the physical gestational costs that allow them to hunt big game. It might also be that they just have more of a tolerance for taking dangerous risks, and women just are not as enticed by the opportunity of hunting a dangerous animal as a man would be. And so there are psychological um, predispositions that cause certain cultures to develop life ways as well as um, morphological.
I think that's right. Yeah, so certainly I don't take me to be arguing like selection stops at the neck, right? Like
Yeah.
this is honestly, I've sort of backed into social role theory in the process of doing all this, but like this
Yeah.
is totally different from social role theory. But I do think sex does structure psychological adaptations, and those psychological adaptations, in addition to the physiological adaptations, are going to be part of what shapes sex differences in these kinds of life ways. So I'm focusing on like foraging and like gestation just because I think those are like really clear, like we definitely know those are uncontroversially exist and uncontroversially, shape these aspects of life ways that have important consequences for other things. But yeah, like I'm confident that there are psychological adaptations that follow from sex that also play into these kinds of processes as well.
Right. So in the
Yeah,
oh, sorry, Dan, go
good,
ahead.
good.
I was just going to say, so like from a learning perspective, for me, it's helpful to think about the ways to get a robot wrong. So it'd
Yeah,
be something where like if you built um, a learning robot that was like, I'm a baby, look around at the other babies and figure out the baby that like gets the most attention. And that's like what I want to grow up to be. Like that's a bad
Mhm.
design, right? So you have to like
Yeah.
build in that there's like life or like there's developmental morphs. And so part of, maybe I should compare myself to other babies too for the purposes of currently being a baby, but you can't design me to sort of aspire to be the best baby 40 years from now that I can possibly be, right? Like that's the wrong sort of social learning target to be. So you have to build somewhere de facto into the system like age morphs too. And the argument is just like age morphs, then it's also sex morphs to the extent that there are differences in the ecology or in your psychology, so that if you built a robot that didn't see sex or gender, you might sort of mash things up and it wouldn't work right, maybe.
I think that's exactly right. So, I mean, it might be helpful to talk a little bit about like what the models look like right now.
Mm,
Uh, so, the way I've been doing this, we just take that population of agents where we evolved like uh, pair bonding and biparental care. So now, like these agents are forming into monogamous pairs, and what I then expose the agents to is basically like they have like a household that they need to manage. Like they need to gather a certain amount of resources and they reproduce together proportional to how successful they are at gathering those resources. The resources they need to gather, I'm just focusing for simplicity on like three things. They need to gather like there's two nutrients that like I'm calling them like nutrient P and nutrient M for like plant and meat. And then they need to do a certain amount of parenting. And they have a fixed time budget that they can use to like gather those resources. At the end of that time budget, they reproduce based on how successful they've been. They can get those. It's like the model's complicated. I'm not going to be able to describe it today. You can read the paper when it comes out. But it's a Markov decision process where like there's a bunch of states the agents can be in. There's a bunch of actions they can choose. Those actions probabilistically generate those resources. The important thing is like there's 11 actions they can take. One of them is like parent your offspring. The other 10 are just different food resources that the agents can gather. Those food resources generate a certain amount of those nutrients that they need, and so they need to learn like what's the right balance of parenting and gathering these other food resources to like maximize my household's sort of store of resources. And so we can create different environments for the agents by manipulating properties of those food resources. So we can make some of them like in this ecology, meat number one is super productive. Meat number two is not very productive. But in that ecology, it's meat number two that's super productive, and it's meat number one that's not very productive. We can manipulate, like, are these dangerous? Like, is there some probability of injuring yourself if you pursue this resource versus that resource? We can manipulate, like, what's the success rate? Like, is this a really risky resource, like large game hunting, or is it a really stable resource, like, like lots of gathered resources? And then the critical one is we can manipulate, like, is foraging this resource compatible with childcare or not? So in some ecologies, maybe all the resources are pretty compatible with childcare. Like anybody can forage anything relatively easy. And so, the sex differences in life ways are going to be relatively small. But in other ecologies, like maybe one of the most important resources you need is really not compatible with childcare. That would be like a sort of large game hunting kind of situation. And in that case, like the optimal life way is for small gamete producers to focus on foraging that resource and large gamete producers to specialize in producing other resources. There should be a sexual division of labor. So we like throw these agents into ecologies that vary unpredictably on these different dimensions. And then we give them different ways of evolving, sort of like, I'm calling them foraging strategies. Maybe I should call them like life ways. But basically, there's like three kinds of agents in the first model. There's ones that just have like a genetically encoded foraging strategy. Like they're just born like, I like meat one, I don't like meat two, and that doesn't change throughout their lifetime. There's other agents that like have a psychology that does reinforcement learning. Like they pay attention to how successful have I been at pursuing this resource in the past, and that adjusts how they behave in the future. And what you can show, what I find in the models is if the ecologies are really predictable, right? So like there's no gene flow, there's like different environments, but like offspring are always born into the exact same environments as the parents. The environments never change over time. So this is sort of like the racist model of the world where there's just like stably different kinds of humans. You can know what sort of environment you're going to be born into. In that kind of environment, selection favors a genetically encoded foraging strategy. Like it just makes sense to be born knowing like my people eat fish. I'm going to get ready to forage for fish. But if environments are unpredictable, if there's some amount of gene flow, like there's some probability you might be born in a different environment than the ones that your parents were born into, then selection no longer favors that genetically encoded strategy. It favors a psychology of reinforcement learning. It favors a psychology that tries to figure out, how to make a living in the ecology where you happen to have been born. And it specifically favors a psychology that engages in what's called model-based reinforcement learning. So these agents, they not only pay attention to like, how much reward did I get when I tried that action last time, but they also slowly build up a model of how the environment works. So they can make guesses like, if I do this action, this is what's going to happen next. And so they can use that to like make even more accurate predictions about how to behave. And I think it's that model of how does my ecology work, that I think is where gender really exists. So that first model is just showing like, variability in foraging will generate selection favoring this kind of learning psychology. The next model is, okay, if we set up environments such that like they're random, but there's some probability that a sexual division of labor is going to be optimal, like there's some important resource that is not compatible with childcare. We have a population of agents who all do reinforcement learning, but now we add in a new mutation that regulates whether they do social learning, right? So the original agents are just learning based on their own experience. But I mean, exactly as you were saying, Dave, now we have agents who, when they're born, they can look at the adults in their ecology. They can observe their behavior. And instead of just learning based on their own behavior, what they can do is they start to form a model of the environment based on observing adult behavior. So they're getting a head start on learning their life way because they're using the information that already exists from the adults in their ecology. And you can do that in one of two ways. Like you can do that ignorant to sex. So you can just say, I'm going to look at any adult behavior is useful. I'm going to use that to train my model of the environment, and then I'm going to use that model to guide my own behavior. Or you can do it in a sort of sex-aware way where you can train different models for adults of different sexes, and then you can use whichever model is applicable to your body, right? And what you see is, as long as at least some ecologies have a sexual division of labor, at least in some ecologies, there are some resources that are not compatible with childcare. Selection favors the learning agents that learn from adults in a sex-differentiated way. Like they're born with an expectation that there's some kind of sexual division of labor, and it's my job to figure out like what is my specialty in this economy, right? And so I think that is how we should think about the psychology of gender, right? Like what gender is your model of how sex manifests in the particular ecology where you happen to have been born.
Cool. And it also suggests that there's a representation of what you are, that is almost by definition not the adult version yet, right?
Yeah, I mean, so it implies a lot. It implies there's a representation of what you are, which I think is what people often talk about as gender identity.
Yeah.
To your point earlier, David, there has to be a representation of what other people are, which will involve probably some amount of signaling. And I think that's what people often talk about as gender expression. In the model, those are always perfectly aligned, but of course, in the real world, they're not going to be. There are going to be people who, identify with a sex that is different from what their physiology is. And so I think that gives you a model of like, how can you start to think about like transgender identities, for example. So I think you get a lot of things that we think intuitively are involved in the concepts of sex and gender out of this, as well as, a model of like, what is it that kids are actually trying to learn and how are they trying to learn it, right?
Yeah.
And it's like to your earlier point, like these ideas do exist out there, right? Like there's lots of work in developmental psychology on like gender essentialism, like kids, essentialize gender as this category and they like attach all kinds of ideas to it. There's like developmental intergroup theory, right? Which suggests that like kids learn from adult behaviors about like what categories there are in the world. So because adults treat gender as a category that matters, kids learn to do the same. And I think like it's similar to those in that like it's saying yes that it's right, but it's not just like an arbitrary
Yeah.
categorization that kids are like picking out of the world. Like no, like kids for very good reason are born with an expectation that gender is probably a thing that shapes life ways, and their job as kids is to figure out, like in my particular ecology, how does sex manifest? Like what is the right way to be male in this place I happen to have been born? So
Yeah.
I think it like aligns with those things, but it's sort of like it connects them with what we know about our species evolutionary history, and it gives us a computational model of how that psychology is actually working.
Yeah, and like for my own expertise in thinking about alliances or even
Yeah.
race, right? People always talked about like, well, there's categories that are inferentially rich, like age, sex, race slash alliance. But people always acknowledge that learning about alliances and or race or whatever arbitrary sets, as Jim Sidanius called it, was different than gender.
Mm.
But there was no theory of that. It was just sort of like we all have that intuition. That's what the data shows. And I like that this gives teeth to that, which is it's the difference between there's a difference between alliances and the which morphs or ways of making a living, to what degree are those different? Those are different features of the world, right? Like the particular alliances and who's on whose side is different than this is the way you kind of make a living given the nature of the ecology or the environment,
Yeah,
which again
yeah.
is different than age. They all interact, right, to some degree. But I really like that. Yeah, that it gives it computational teeth, and you could start to think about like how a robot would be built. It creates a task. You could do a task analysis of this. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
I
Yeah, no,
want to
yeah, yeah. Oh, good.
uh, I want to explore how intrasexual competition fits into this because I feel like this is probably a really important process by which sex and gender manifests. So, the sexes choose among the other sex whom to mate with. Within sexes, people choose their friends and allies, and they compete with other members of their sex for status, for access to mates. And I feel like this is probably playing a big role in gender expression, gender signaling. It seems to me that if there's a particular sexual division of labor, such that, say, men invest in big game hunting and women invest in, say, gathered resources, um, it seems to me that women would have an interest in mating with the best big game hunters, and men would have an interest in mating with the best gatherers. And there may even be some invariances as well, insofar as the small gamete sex is going to invest more in dangerous risk taking and have a lower or have a higher appetite for dangerous risks. Or they might be bigger and stronger and more. They might be more geared toward fighting with other members of their sex. In cases where there are extreme sex roles, the females will prefer the biggest and strongest males because they're going to give them the most successful offspring. Uh, or in cases where there's more intersexual selection, they might prefer the males with the most colorful tail feathers or the most eye-catching song and dance routine. Males similarly might prefer the females who have cues of higher health or fertility or are going to provide more investment for their offspring. So it seems like there is selection within each sex to signal a kind of prototypicality, where if I'm a male, I want to signal that I'm the biggest and strongest, most competitive male, or the male with the most colorful tail feathers. If I'm a female, I might want to signal that I'm going to provide the best investment and nourishment for offspring. I'm the healthiest and the most fertile, or whatever. That might be occurring, at an abstract level across sex roles, across species, but it'll obviously manifest differently in a human setting with sexual divisions of labor. But it seems like sexual or gender prototypicality is playing a big role here and signaling that I'm a particularly good big game hunter. I'm a particularly good at the tasks that my sex pursues in this life way.
I think that's right. So, I mean, there's lots of things to pick up on there.
Yeah.
I think one is, so I've been talking about this in terms of like what the gender concept is like you learning the best sort of life way for you. It's like a very selfish, kind of individualistic way of thinking about it. But yeah, like if we think that's gender, you could ask, well, why would we ever care about other people's gender concepts, which we very clearly do, right? Like so much
Yeah.
of like sort of contemporary sort of social issues and so much of moralizing is like moralizing how other people think about or enact gender. And so like why would we do that if what gender is just like you figuring out how to live your life in your ecology? So I do have like the last model in the paper is sort of like starting to get into those kinds of questions, like why would we ever care or reason about other people's gender concepts? And I think there's lots of reasons why we should, if that's what gender is, and you've touched on some of them. Like there are lots of cases where how other people think about gender is relevant to your interests. I think one is, yeah, that you hit on already is if we are, we're sexually reproducing species and we're also these like, biparental, relatively lifelong monogamous maters, like it really matters if there is like a sexual division of labor, or just even if there's not, it just like really matters if I'm going to be attaching my reproductive interests to one other person. It really matters that like we have compatible understandings of like what our roles are.
Mm.
So that we both are like, investing in the right like skills and activities that are going to be like, maximizing our shared reproductive interests. And so I'm going to have, yeah, strong opinions that like whatever my concept of gender is, I'm going to want to make sure that my mate has a concept of gender that like plays along with that one, and that like they're enacting the role that I think they should be enacting in a relatively effective way so that we can, maximize our shared reproductive interests. So I think that's one case, like in the mating market, like you're going to want to make sure like whoever you mate with, they're on the same page as you in terms of like how do you make a living in the psychology that we live in. I think there's another case where like you should really care about your offspring's gender concepts, right? Because if your gender concept is shaping your life way, like you as an adult invested a lot of time and effort and energy learning a good life way, like you want to make sure that like your kid does the same, because if there's no value in you successfully reproducing if like your kid then learns like the optimal thing to do is like eat rocks and hit my head with a hammer, right? Like so you want to make sure that like they're learning a good life way as well. And so it makes sense that parents would have strong feelings about like what is their children's models of their environment, and therefore like what is their children's concepts of gender, and does that align with what you think is a correct life way for the ecology that you live in. And that I have a model of that, right? So we go into this population that has evolved this like sex differentiated learning strategy. We can manipulate like our environments relatively stable over time, so that like the kinds of environments where parents tend to live in are similar to the kinds of environments where offspring tend to live in, or do they change relatively quickly? Like is the optimal foraging strategy pretty different from generation to generation? And I can introduce this gene that's basically like, if you're high, I call it like a gender policing gene, for lack of a better word, where basically like agents that are high on this gene, what they do is parent agents who have already learned a good policy, what they can do is they can sort of intervene in their offspring's behavior. They can prevent the offspring from enacting their own policy, and they can just force their offspring to do what the parent would have done, which I think intuitively we feel like parents often do to their children. So if you're high on this gene, you sort of prevent your offspring from learning their own policy. They just implement your policy. The advantage of that, if the environment is relatively similar, you've already learned a good policy. So your offspring they're not gonna waste a lot of time sort of learning and exploring and trying out things that don't work. They get the benefit of your knowledge. They're going to implement a good life way right from the beginning. They're going to outcompete those other kids that are left to like try things out on their own. That works if the environment is stable. If the environment is unstable, though, that's a terrible strategy, right? Because the environment your kid has inherited is different from the one where you trained your policy. And so letting them learn their own policy is probably going to be the more optimal thing to do. And yeah, you see, depending on the structure of the environment, when environments are stable, selection favors this kind of like policing strategy of like impose your gender concept onto your offspring. But if environments are unstable, then selection favors parents that kind of back off and let their children learn their own strategy. So I think like these are the kinds of situations where agents would have strong feelings about and would try to intervene on the ways that other agents think about and like express their gender concepts. And if you think about like if you take that for granted, right? Okay, parents have an interest in making sure their offspring develop good gender policies. Well, then if you know that the way that your offspring are developing these gender policies is by looking at adults and building a model based on adult behavior, well, then that gives you reason to care about what other adults are doing, right? Because you want to make sure your kids have good targets around. So that's why you would care about like the gender policy, even of like unrelated adult strangers, right? Like, I don't want you projecting a what I think is a bad life way because my kid is going to look at you and that's going to become part of their model and then they're going to start behaving in suboptimal ways. And so all of this just creates grounds for like all kinds of conflict between individuals about like what is the proper way to think about gender, think about life ways in your ecology and to enact those things. And I think that potentially explains like so much of like culture war about sex and gender
Yeah.
today.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, there's also, parent-offspring conflict, I bet, plays a role. So there's research showing that parents and children diverge in their preferences for mates for their children. So, children tend to care more about physical attractiveness, say, than their parents do when choosing mates for their children. And parents care more about cultural similarity than the children do.
Yeah.
And you could imagine that, cultural similarity is going to have better inclusive fitness benefits for the parent because that's going to allow for more for less investment. Number one, less investment from them that's going to be required because they're going to be better at investing and pooling labor. And number two, perhaps better cooperative opportunities with their kin. And so parents want more cooperation among kin than the kin wants. The kin want
Yep.
twice as much stuff as kids want twice as much stuff as their sibling, but parents want to distribute investment equally. So all else equal, the parent is going to want the kids to choose mates that are more culturally similar than the kid will want. And so that could play a role in here as well, where, parents are going to want adherence to whatever the life way is among their kids more than their kids will.
I think that's exactly right. Yeah, I think even in cases where you think the environment is the same, parents and offspring don't have overlapping interests, and so there's room for conflict over like how you think about and manifest gender, even in that scenario. But there's also like, I mean, so my former postdoc Elizabeth Aggie has like done a lot of that work. You should have her on the pod; she'd be a great guest.
Yeah.
But I think that's exactly right. I think it's a really good point. It is also like just for simplicity, I've been modeling this as if like environments are either stable or they're not stable. But the reality is like environments vary in how stable they are. And that's something you need to make an inference about, right? Like when you're born, you need to ask yourself, like, is my ecology going to be the same as the adults in my ecology? And different people can make different inferences based on the kinds of information they're getting, and also just like the kind of body they particularly have, right? Like it might be the environment is the same, but like what worked for my dad just won't work for me because my dad and me are different people. And so my dad might be getting information like my policy is still going to be really good for my son. He needs to behave this way. And I'm getting information like, nope, I got to chart a different path. Like what worked for him is not going to work out for me. And so that can generate sort of intergenerational conflict, even in the same ecology, just because like there's no way to know who's right, right? Both agents are having to make inferences based on uncertain information, and they might just make different inferences about the best way to go, and that's going to cause conflict. And there will be adaptations. There will be selection for adaptations that sort of tip that conflict in either direction.
That reminds me, it was that we had Zach Garfield on, and he talked about how the son of a really good hunter didn't want to do that. I think it was a hunter. And he just, and Zach characterized it as the kid seemed to know soon and early that he didn't want to do that. Wasn't his life way. And this is not even per se a gendered one. I mean, it might be also, but it was more just sort of that, this was not, I'm not built, I'm not built to do the trajectory that I see my successful dad pursuing. And I love that about this too, is it hooks up to this sort of niche construction
Yeah.
whether it's gendered or not, there's also this thing of looking out of the world and saying, how am I going to make a living and succeed? We've talked about that a lot in a lot of different ways with a lot of different people for a lot of different reasons, like parenting, status games, resources, and thinking about like what am I particularly good at, and
Mhm.
figuring that out. And that's really cool that it hooks up to that too.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. Yeah, and there's an individual difference angle that I'm also sort of like under exploring. But yeah, there's just like you can think about like what is the kind of optimal set of life ways in your ecology, but like those are not those are almost guaranteed to not be optimal for you, right? Like at the end of the day, you're still going to have to tailor your life way to you in particular, and that's going to differ from how everyone else sees this, just because of reactive heritability, right? Like the body you happen to inherit is going to shape what is the right way to do things for
Yeah.
you.
It's
Yeah.
almost like, oh, sorry, David. I was just going to say, it's almost like gender is almost like gamete-based personality, where it's sort of
Yeah,
like,
yeah.
it's like,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah,
I like that way of describing it and thinking about it. And of course, personality is affected by life way and the different socio-ecological niches that can be filled. Um, that's interesting. I feel like there's something missing here in that gender is not merely a dichotomy, but a continuum, and that I can think of men who are more or less masculine. I can think of women who are more or less feminine. Um, and to some extent, that is a mate preference. Men might prefer more feminine women, and women might prefer more masculine men. Um, and so, how are you thinking about uh, the continuum of masculinity or femininity, and how that might play into mate preferences, status games, uh, uh, etc.
So it's a great question. And I think one sort of upshot of thinking about gender in this way that I haven't been super clear about either is, and this comes out of the models as well, like gender, yes, like I think we should think about gender as being these kinds of folk theories about how sex manifests. And yes, sex tends to be, binary if we think about it as like there are these what sex is are these optima, and in our species there seems to be two. But that doesn't mean that gender roles themselves need to be binary. Um, and you can have, depending on the structure of the ecology, like there can be multiple good strategies for a large gamete producer. There can be multiple good strategies for a small gamete producer. And people can specialize in like different ways of being a man or different ways of being a woman. So you don't need to think about gender as being binary. Thinking about gender as being folk theories of sex does not imply that gender itself has to be binary. And even if it were the case that, like, in a particular ecology, there's just one sort of relatively good strategy for being a male, like, because of how all of this works, like, every individual is going to learn a slightly different, perspective on what that is, right? Because every individual, they, they're forming their model based on, somewhat random observations of adults in their environment. So all of their models are going to be slightly different variations on that same thing. Part of doing reinforcement learning is like there is randomness inherent in the learning because you have to try out different things, and there's going to be randomness in terms of the reward those actions give you. So some agents are just going to, there's going to be some variation in how rewarding they find different actions. And so there can be multiple optimal strategies, and for any given optimal strategy, any agent's sort of like assessment of what that strategy looks like is going to vary to some degree. And that variation is also going to feed forward into like the role models that those agents provide for the next generation. I think thinking about gender in this way like naturally gives you all of this variation in gender concepts. You don't have to think about these things, and they don't emerge as being sort of like strict binary, like this is what a man is and this is what a woman is. And then, of course, these things are all ecologically specific. So, like, what is a man in this environment is going to differ from what is a man in that environment because it's all about learning how does sex manifest in this particular ecology. So there's, it also gives you this like cross-cultural variation and like what is masculinity, right?
Yeah, and I think the non-binary part also would explain the continuum, right? Because if, for example, let's just say risk taking, if there's just because of the gamete selection pressures, there are versions of stable equilibria of male, we'll just call them male and female for exposition, male type stable equilibria of ways of making a living. On average, some of those are going to be really high risk taking, but maybe not everyone. Maybe there's a lower
Mhm.
risk taking male stable equilibrium, but so therefore you're going to get a continuum of risk taking among men, and same for women. It might just be that there's a really low risk taking stable equilibrium for women, but there's another stable equilibrium for women that's not as averse to risk taking. And so consequently, because it's not binary, but there's actually multiple stable equilibria within each class, that's exactly what you would perceive as a continuum, right?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. That's exactly right. And yeah, we can model this if you want. I've set up models where, um, let's say there's two resources that are compatible with childcare, but they both are really skill intensive. Like they both require a lot of time invested to get good at foraging them, and so you can't specialize in both of them. You set that up for these agents, they naturally like pick one or the other to specialize. So you get sort of two kind of life ways that emerge within a given sex. And you can imagine building more complicated versions of that exactly along those lines. Like, one of the dimensions is like how dangerous is this food to forage? Maybe how dangerous it is depends on some aspect of your phenotype that varies relatively continuously. So yeah, maybe some individuals are willing or able to take on those risks, and so that becomes like a viable life way for them. Others are not willing or able to take on that risk, so that becomes a viable life way. And yeah, so there's like a maybe spectrum of how much people are investing in those particular life ways, or maybe there's like a balance that you can do. There's a range of different life ways based on how you mix that activity into your sort of portfolio of overall activities. So yeah, these things don't need to be like rigid categories. They can emerge as the more variable structures that they actually are.
Yeah. And it suggests, like, I mean, you mentioned you alluded this to the mating thing, but I think a lot of partner choice, whether it's like choosing a mentor or a friend, like I think I've had the experience of you just meet somebody and there's something about the way they're constituent they're made up of that just really it's very like compelling. And you're just like, oh, I want to really learn from this person, or like this
Yeah,
is makes a really good friend. And sometimes it's maybe that you're the same, like you detect that there's something weird about me, and I don't know how to make this weird thing in me work as to make a living. And then you find somebody who has that same thing in you, and then you can sort of learn from them. Like I think
yeah,
that
yeah,
that's like a lot of tropes of mentorship, or like I found my tribe, is sort of the that trope. And then there's also just like the complementariness too. Somebody else is good at this thing that I'm bad in. And this suggests that both for like finding mentors and friends and mates, it suggests there's this very rich psychological like landscape of these folk representations that we might not, there might be literature on that maybe not be framed this way, but it really suggests that we probably like a lot of friendship choice, like if the friendship literature, a lot of it is sort of like similarity writ large, but I suspect it's actually a lot of like what we're talking about, what you're talking about here. It's about like ways of making a living, status game kind of things. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. I think you're right. The paper's already like 15,000 words, so I'm gonna
This is this is
tender, but
definitely
I
a
do
BBS
think
paper. It would be a sin if this doesn't get into BBS for people
it's
who
already
don't know,
prone
because
for
it gives
BBS. I need to
people
figure out official.
a venue, many areas to comment on. Because as a partial developmental psychologist, I find this like it connects so many areas of developmental psychology that have been unconnected with so many other areas that are not developmental psychology, like mating or parenting or
Yeah,
friendship. Yeah,
good. I'm glad to hear
10 out of 10.
Well, yeah. Looking forward to the BBS paper. Um,
that. From your lips
well,
to Paul Bloom's ears.
Yeah.
yes, if you're listening, Paul Bloom, you gotta accept this one. Um,
Pins off 2026.
all right. Well, I mean, we're about
We're
two
on it.
hours now.
Yeah.
Yeah. Is
Dang.
there anything we should have asked you that we missed? Dan?
Oh shoot! I knew that question was coming, and I still failed to prepare an answer.
Maybe we don't have to ask it for a repeat. I don't know.
Oh
Should
yeah,
we have
for
asked you that? Should we?
oh should we have asked you that? Maybe a better
I
question.
think
Is
we
Maybe
that a
maybe a
should
better
have
good?
question.
asked
Is there
that.
anything we asked you that we shouldn't have? That should be that should be for repeat guests. What shouldn't we have asked you about?
I mean,
I
since
I think
we got our 1 year anniversary, like maybe we should consider whether we should continue that tradition or not.
Yes, exactly.
oh,
No.
you know, I do like the tradition, but I do feel
Yeah,
like it's got a low hit rate. Like, how many guests have
that's true.
actually
That's true.
said something? I
I
think
like
it's
the
like only
idea
two
of
or three.
I like the idea of you have to pick something we shouldn't have asked you. I like this. This is like the signal detection thing. We shouldn't just err on the side of the things we missed, the hits there, or the things we should
Or
have
what's
not.
the dumbest thing we said? What's the thing you least like about us?
Who's the dumbest guest we've had on, Dan? And you can who's the
Ooh.
dumbest person on this podcast that and it can include the hosts. That's the
I'll tell you my answer
I
offline.
think it's me. I think it's me. But yeah. Oh, this is yeah. Do you have an answer?
No, I think this has been it's been a really helpful conversation for me just to try to like air all these things out as I'm trying to write this paper. So I've got things to think about. I
Awesome.
don't.
Yeah. Yeah. Every time, and Dan, every time I hear this, I think there's so much developmental stuff to do on this too. So it's just, this is super exciting. This is awesome. Yeah. I think.
I hope people see it as like, yeah, I'm worried it will come off as like we've been saying this all along. Like, why are you just coming around to this? I need to figure out how to pitch it as like, yeah, like we're trying to sort of join your stream rather than kind of like steal your thunder.
Yeah. Well, I think connecting
Yeah.
it up from like I mean, what I like, I don't think it's self-indulgent. Like my will editorialize for a second. You said earlier it's self-indulgent to start at like the evolution of sex, but I actually think it's crucial in the sense of you're doing this form like really methodically, logically. And if there's one thing evolutionary behavioral sciences is about, is sort of you're just like, I'm checking my assumptions. Does this follow? Without sort of grasping at some phenomena. Like obviously the phenomena is a thing to be explained, but it's not like all of a sudden you're like, well, we gotta like kind of, round up and round down to accommodate this known phenomena. You're like deriving it from first principles. And of course, the fact that you're recovering it, that's a virtue, not a vice, right? So I don't think it's self-indulgent. Like, and I do think it's a contribution to provide a causal framework attached to all these different pieces.
Yeah, it's a synthesis. It's a helpful.
Yeah,
I think that
yeah,
might be
it's a
one way
good
to
one.
frame it.
Yeah.
Uh, you're bringing all this stuff together in one place when it hasn't been together in one place before, and I think that is doing a service to the field.
Yeah, I like that. A synthesis of gender. That's actually a lovely way of putting what you're doing. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it sounds like the name of a book I might find in a humanities section, which is fine by me.
Or a robot
Synthesis of
factory
gender.
that's going to build robots with gender. Yeah.
No, that's helpful. I need to remember to frame it that way. Maybe that'll be the subtitle of the paper. A synthesis.
There you go.
Awesome. Well, on that
A
note,
sexy synthesis. You can steal that.
I will.
all right, Dan, awesome. Good to see you. And good luck. We look forward to hearing more about this.
Thank you. Thank you guys for having me back.
David, stickers?
Oh yeah, we got to print out stickers for HBES.
Yeah.
Do you think stickers is the way to go in terms of the stuff to hand out?
Yeah, because you can put in stickers on anything like a mug or
That's true.
a fanny pack.
Yeah.
Not an
Yeah.
animal. You wouldn't want to put
A
a.
lapel pin is sort of limited to clothing, I guess, which is the downside of a pin.
Were you thinking lapel pin?
Just throwing out possible options.
That's pretty highbrow.
Yeah, it is a little highbrow. Yeah.
Although you could use what are those things that are like the stuffed animals that all the kids are hanging off their backpacks? It's Labubu's or something like that.
Oh yeah, kids are into the. Should we do evolutionary psychology Lagubus? I don't even know what that would
Yeah, I
look
don't
like.
even know what that would look like. I'm imagining a Care Bear. Do you remember the Care Bears where they had like symbols on their bellies? I'm imagining a Care Bear with like a brain and the logo on its belly, but I don't know. Maybe it would be a brain. I don't know.
Yeah.
Not the best
I
way.
think
Yeah.
I feel like that would take a lot of funding to figure out.
A lot of time and effort. We're worried about the ability to get stickers done. So yeah, that might
Yeah.
be, yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
Anyway, on that note, uh yeah.
Support us. If you want those Labubus, you got to pony up on Patreon.
I think this will get posted before HBest, so we look forward to seeing everybody at HBest. And yeah, maybe I'll bring a lavalier mic and we can do a few like short recordings at HBest.
Oh yeah, that'd be fun. Oh yeah, so sort of like man on the street kind of
Yeah,
thing.
exactly. Yeah,
We just
exactly. Yeah.
assault people with a microphone and ask them.
Wasn't there a shtick
Tell,
like people would ask people like what's the capital of the United States and people would like I don't know Albany, like wasn't that a thing? It was like Conan or Jay Leno or somebody.
oh yeah, classic bit. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
Should we ask gotcha questions to everyone at HBS?
That seems like a really mean thing to do, so probably yes. No, I don't
Yeah.
know. I was joking. Yeah. No,
Uh,
no, I don't know. Yeah, but we can it might be a nice way to like feature students or just like the diversity of people attending HBUS. I don't know.
yeah. No, it'd be fun.
Yeah. We'll
It's a great
see.
idea.
Yeah.
All right.
Okay. We'll probably edit this out because we won't, well, we might do it. Yeah. All right. Thank you everybody for listening. And we'll see you next week.
Yep. See ya.